Hey everyone, it's James from Tin Robot Games, and today we're going to learn how to play Time Splicers. It's the year 2222, and humanity's worst nightmare has come to fruition. The AI has become self-aware, also known as the Singularity. In order to help humankind, it's decided to enslave humankind. As Earth's last-ditch attempt, its scientists have invented time travel, and it sent you Time Splicers back in time, tried to close off this current timeline by finding the elusive time crystals that are scattered across the eras. Now, the Singularity knows that you're trying to do this, so it has also sent itself back in time to fracture the timeline into parallel paths so it can arrive at the same conclusion. All right, now let's get started. Okay, let's talk about the components that come with Time Splicers before we get into how to play. You'll see special cards we have off to the side. Hourglass is a time freezing card. We have a quantum tunnel. We have a time jump card. We have 4 different timelines, the blue, the pink, the yellow, and the silver. In each timeline, there are 13 eras, and that spans from the Bronze Age all the way through to the Singularity, 13 cards. Off to the side, we'll have the time portal. This is what you spawned from. You can see both sides, it's the same image. We have time jump tokens, which are the lightning bolts. We're going to give 2 of those to each player. We have time freezing markers, which are the cubes that match the player's meeple color. You're going to give the player 2 of each of those, and each player is going to have a large translucent meeple as their player marker. And then off to the side, of course, we have the deck. So start by shuffling the cards and deal out 4 cards to each player. Place the rest of the cards one side of the table. On the other end of the table, you're going to place the time portal. Again, it's the same image on both sides, but within reach of all players. Time crystals off to the side, and the extra time jumps off to the side. Flip over the top card and place everyone's meeples on that. That is a starting era and timeline for all players. In this case, we have a 9, which is World War I, and it is silver. Be mindful that every card has a number in the top left-hand corner to make it easy for you to know that when you're placing a card, is that card greater or less than the card that you're currently on. So let's go through the basic movements before we get into collapsing timelines. Collapsing timelines is how we find time crystals. So first, let's talk about movement. On a player's turn, they must either place a card and move on to it, or they must move on to a card that's already on the table and then draw another card. Players always must draw up to 4 cards at the end of their turn, but can never exceed 7 cards. If at any point you exceed 7 cards, you must discard your entire hand and give up one of your time boosters. If you get to a point where you have to give up a time booster and you don't currently have one, you are immediately out of the game. So you want to make sure that you're spending your time boosters sparingly. A player has a couple options when they place a card on their turn. So in this case, let's just move these out of the way, and we're going to talk about the pink player for now. The pink player can place a card either to the right or to the left of this current card, and the card they place must be greater. And I'll use some of the cards from this other hand off to the side just to give a good example. So in this case, if a player wants to place, say, an 11, they can place that. It's greater than 9, and there's no cards in between, so it allows them to move on to that card. Now, say, for instance, this 11 was already here, and they wanted to place a 12. They cannot jump this current card. What they would have to do is they would have to spend 1 turn moving on to this card, picking up a card, and then on their next turn, placing the 12 and moving on to it. There are the options if there are cards already on the table. So say, for instance, the 12 was here and the 11 wasn't, and the player was on the 9 card. If they had 11 they wanted to play, they could play that card. They simply stretch the timeline and place this card in between the card they're currently on and the 12, as long as these cards are constantly going in an increasing value in numerical order. Likewise, a player, if they're in this current situation, if they wanted to play a card earlier in the timeline, they could place a 2, which is the Iron Age, and they can move back in time. In this case, from a 9 to 2, that's a valid move. They go on to the next player for their turn. Say the blue player was also on the 9, and the pink player went before them and placed a 2. Well, this player could, again, stretch the timeline and place a 5, which falls between the 2 and the 9, and move on to it. Anytime you are not placing cards you're moving on to, you must move still 1 spot, and then you must pick up a card. There's also an option throughout the game of forming parallel timelines. So in this case, say the green player was on the 9 and they had a pink 9 in their hand as well. So the number matches, they would simply place it, starting another row, and they can move onto that timeline with their player token. They're split the timeline. Now, as they're moving throughout this timeline, they're placing down pink cards. Now, if one of these other players were able to create an alternate timeline, so there's 3 or 4 concurrent parallel timelines, that would create what's called a fixed point in time, and they would get to take a time jump token from the general supply. More on the time jump tokens in a second, but here's how that would work. Say the blue player was also on the 9 in the gray timeline. If they placed a blue 9 in this case and moved on to it, you would have 3 cards, all at the same number. That's a fixed point in time. They would take a time jump token from the general supply and add it to their personal pile. Now let's look at another scenario. Say there's a situation like this where the blue player has the Singularity card they want to place, which is to the right of the 12 here, and they don't want to spend 3 turns to get there to place that card down. They have the option during the game to either spend a time boost, which is lightning bolt, or likewise, cards that are throughout the deck. There's gonna be chances we're gonna actually have lightning bolt cards. They have the option of either playing a token or a time jump card. They're both the same thing, and that allows them to jump as a free action to the card they want to start the turn on, then place the card during their turn. Just keep in mind throughout the game, if the card has a number on it, you're placing that card, you're moving on to it. If you're placing any card that's a special card, and I'll show these other cards in a second, they are free actions. You always place these at the beginning of your turn at no cost, but then you still must take your turn, which is placing a card and moving on to it, or moving on to a card and then drawing from the deck. So let's talk about some of these other special cards that we have. So we've already talked about the time jump card, which is the same as a time jump token. This card allows a player to jump anywhere within their current timeline. They can go forward or backwards in time. They cannot jump into another timeline, however. They must stay within this current timeline. But if, for instance, the player has a quantum tunnel card, they can use this card literally to jump anywhere on the board. They can jump anywhere within their current timeline. They could also jump to another timeline as long as the card is available on the board. Free action, and then they take their turn from there. Let's put the time freeze card off to the side for now. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Lastly, a player has an option on their turn to jump back into the time portal. Now remember, we had this card off to the side. Say the green player in their turn doesn't really have any cards that they really want to play at this moment. They have the option of jumping into the time portal, and then they must draw 2 cards as a result of jumping into the time portal. Their turn is over and it goes to the next player. Again, be very mindful of this, because picking up 2 cards, if you already have 6 in your hand, is going to push you over that limit, and it's going to cause you to discard your entire hand. Once someone is in the time portal, they have the option on their next turn of jumping back into any card that is on the table, similar to the quantum tunnel card. However, the one key difference is they could actually respawn onto a card that they've placed. Now, there is also an option with these time boost tokens that if you want to just discard your hand anyways, you have that option as well. You can discard a token, you can discard your entire hand, and you can draw 4 new cards back up to start a fresh hand if you want to take that particular risk. So those are the core movements. Once again, if you're placing a card, you're moving on to that card. It has to be adjacent to the card you're currently on, whether it's in the current timeline or if you're starting a new timeline with a number that equals the number of the card you're currently on. If you're not placing a card, you still must move your token 1 space adjacent, even if it's going into another timeline on an equal number. However, if you do that, you must pick up a card at the end of your turn. All right, now let's talk about how we collapse timelines, which is how you find the elusive time crystals. Collapsing timelines can be done in 3 different ways. I'm going to go through examples of all 3 of these. One is you are emptying a timeline or leaving a timeline vacant. It will automatically collapse if that timeline has no players in it. You can do mini collapses, which is when you have a sequence of numbers of 3 that are in a row. And then finally, there is a total timeline collapse, which happens if you have 5 cards in a timeline that contains a singularity. So let's go through all three of those now. Let's start off with the vacant timeline collapse. An empty timeline will automatically collapse, no matter how many cards there are. Say the blue player is the only one left in this gray timeline, and they decide they want to jump into the pink timeline. Since the pink timeline is a 9, and they're currently on a 9, they can jump to this timeline and pick up a card. Now that this timeline is vacant, it would automatically collapse, and these cards would be discarded, and the player would get 1 time crystal. Now, if this timeline had less than 3 cards, so say the same situation happened, this timeline had a 5 and a 9, but it didn't have this 2, they jumped into this timeline, it would still collapse. These cards would be discarded. However, the player would not get a time crystal. So it's very important if you're trying to score to remember that if you jump out of a timeline and leave it empty, that if you don't have 3 or more cards in that timeline, you're not going to find a time crystal. This is where the hourglass is going to come into play that we talked about earlier on. Say we're in the same situation where the blue player really wants to leave the gray timeline, but they don't want it to collapse. Or say, for instance, the green player and the pink player are on the same card. The blue player wants to play this pink card and jump out of the timeline, but they know if they do that, that the pink player could jump into the time portal, leaving this timeline empty and potentially scoring it. So you don't really want to leave this timeline, but they kind of have to leave the timeline. Well, there's an option that if they have a time freezing card, they can place this card at the end of their timeline. They can place a cube on it that matches their token color to let the other players know that that's the timeline that they froze, and then they can jump out. What the frozen timeline card does is it prevents a timeline from collapsing if it's empty. There's other types of collapses we're going to talk about in a second, but that's the only thing that the frozen timeline card does. It does not impact a mini collapse. It does not impact a full collapse. It only impacts an empty timeline from collapsing. And that's important to remember. So say in this case, the pink player leaves, this timeline is not going to collapse, and they're going to continue playing the game until the blue player comes back. Once the blue player comes back into this timeline, they remove their time freezing card, it gets discarded, and they take their cube marker back. Now, other players may get timeline freezing cards as well, and they also have the opportunity that if they want to freeze this timeline, they can as well. There's no limit to the number of players that can freeze the same timeline, as long as they can place a timeline freezing card down with their marker on top of it. Now let's talk about a mini collapse. A mini collapse happens when you have 3 cards in a row in a sequence in any given timeline. So let's use this as an example. The blue player wants to place a 6. They're going to stretch the timeline because they can place this 6 in between the 5 and the 7 they're currently on, and they move on to it. Because we have a 5, 6, 7, there's 3 cards in a sequence, it creates a mini collapse, and 3 cards are going to come out of this timeline and be discarded. Now in this case, because they've created 2 sequences, they've got a 4, 5, 6, they've got a 6, 7, 8, they've got a 5, 6, 7, actually 3 sequences, they have the opportunity of choosing which 3 cards come out of this timeline as long as one of those contains a 6. So in this case, they're going to decide to take out the 5, 6, and the 7. These cards come out of the deck, out of the timeline. Their token, as well as anyone else's token that happens to be in this timeline, would then move to the earliest card in that timeline, and they would find a time crystal. Now let's talk about a complete timeline collapse. A complete timeline collapse occurs when there are 5 or more cards in a timeline that contains a singularity card. Now, that card could have been there as the 5th card is added, or it could be added as the 5th card. But as long as there's 5 or more cards in that timeline that contains a singularity, that entire timeline is going to collapse. Here's a scenario where this would happen. Let's say the blue player has a singularity card and they're on the 3. On their turn, they can choose to spend a time jump, which is free as an action, jump to the 9, and then their turn begins. They place the 13 and move on to it. We have 5 cards that end in a singularity. This entire timeline is going to collapse. They take all of the meeples that are on that timeline. They choose which timeline they want them to respawn on, and there could be up to 4 timelines on the board at a time. In this case, there's only 1, so they're going to place these onto the 9. And then this entire timeline is going to collapse, and they are going to find 2 time crystals. Now the play is going to continue from the remaining card the players are on. Now, what happens if there's no timeline for the meeples to respawn on? In this particular scenario, say the 9 wasn't there, the player would simply draw another card from the pile, and all the meeples would respawn on that card, and play would continue from that particular card as it did at the beginning of the game. If players respawn onto a quantum tunnel, they have the opportunity of literally placing any card adjacent to this card and moving on to it to start a new timeline. All 3 of these players can start new timelines off of this card if it is the spawn card. And those are the core mechanics of how to play Time Splicers. The play is going to continue on until one player has found their 7th time crystal, at which point they instantly win the game and they've saved humanity. If you have any questions on Time Splicers, or quite frankly any games from Tin Robot Games, please check out our website at tinrobotgames.com or follow us on any of our social media channels at Tin Robot Games. For now, cheers.